want to regulate anyway. And at a time when their mortgage volume went up 1,000%, they cut their regulatory staff 25%. Their chief credit officer quit, and they didn't even replace her. So they went a couple of years there when all this mortgage stuff was going crazy without even a chief credit overseer. And what they said was, and this is where they really started messing things up, they said, when you're qualifying people for a mortgage, you don't have to worry about whether or not they can pay the rate that's going to happen in 2 years. If they can pay that 3.5% or 4% teaser rate, you can make a loan. Well, already you're setting people up, and they won't, they're not going to be able to pay their loans. But we didn't stop there because these investors wanted a higher rate of return, and the feds wanted more folks to get mortgages. So then we started something called an option arm, or an option adjustable rate mortgage. And what that one was is, we're going to have this teaser rate for the first couple of years of 3 or 4%, then it'll go up, but you only have to pay 1% during that time. The rest of it gets tacked on to the principal. There's literally negative amortization. And you could, the OTS said, okay, if they qualify for the 1%, you can make them the loan. Okay? You kind of see where we're headed here? But we didn't stop there, because even that was a problem, because some of these folks couldn't get a loan because the documentation simply wouldn't support it with their income and that sort of thing. So we decided, well, and the OTS said, well, just don't pay attention to the documentation. We can do something called a no-doc loan. It's ridiculous you should have to know somebody's name and address to make them a loan. I mean, let's get real here, okay? So what they would do is, I'm going to step over here a little bit because if I stay on this X, that's the tallest I'm going to be. They told me that, okay? So anyway, so then what happened was you set up a system. Again, these are markets. Markets do wonderful things if they have the proper structure at them. But if you give them a chance to go off the tracks and people are going to make money off of it, they'll go off the tracks. Here's the system we set up. Somebody finds a home they'd really like to have. They walk into the real estate office. The realtors know exactly what the formulas are to get a loan. Okay? And they say to the person, how much money do you make? And they say, I make $50,000 a year. And they say, well, when you're filling out that form, if you put down $70,000, you'll get the loan. And nobody's going to check it. Now, how much did you say you made? Well, a whole bunch of folks rounded up. Okay? So now you've got, people who are going to have to be able to make an 8% loan, pay on an 8% loan. They let them start at 3%. Well, that doesn't get it, but they'll have to pay 1% of that 3%, and they lie to get to qualify for the 1%. Okay? So we got a bunch of mortgages that are going to go bad here. There's no question about it. They're going to go bad. Then we started something called a credit default swaps. You've probably heard the media tell you a lot that credit default swaps and derivatives were the big problem here. You probably hear that all the time. You wonder, what in the heck are they talking about? Well, let me try to give you an idea of what that is. A credit default swap, you can think of it like co-signing a note. It's roughly the same thing. If you ever co-signed a note for your kid to get their first car or something like that, there's nothing wrong with that. But what you're doing is you're swapping the default risk. You're saying, it's not my kid's risk, it's mine. If my kid can't pay for the car, I'll pay for the car. You swap the default risk. That's all a credit default swap is in its simplest form. Well, a very large financial institution, I won't mention their name, their initials are AIG, started issuing credit default swaps on these mortgage-backed securities. Now, 3 years ago, AIG had a AAA rating. Okay, you hear about AAA ratings from time to time. Among large financial institutions, there are only about 5 in the world with a AAA rating. It's unheard of. I mean, they were the safest place around. And they started writing these credit, again, this little division that's set up over here to hedge and do all this fancy stuff, started selling credit default swaps on these mortgage-backed securities. So all of a sudden you have a security, and it's a piece of junk. I mean, it's a bunch of these mortgages are going to go south. But AIG takes the default risk, so it becomes a AAA bond. A AAA bond anybody can buy. Pension funds, insurance companies, very conservative investors can buy AAA bonds because they're regarded as perfectly safe. Now, another bad guy here, the rating agencies, okay? And here's why the rating agencies were bad guys. What if you co-signed a note for your kid to get a car? And you did that, and you can afford to buy the car if the kid didn't come through. But then you say, that felt so good to me. I'm going to do that for every kid in the state of Texas. I'm going to co-sign a note so every kid in Texas can buy a car, okay? Unless you're as rich as Jerry Conner, that's going to cause some problems, okay? Because most of us can afford to pay for one car for a kid. Most of us could not afford to pay for the cars for 5 million Texas teenagers, okay? So the point being, if you co-sign more notes than you could handle, you can get yourself in trouble. AIG started underwriting all these mortgage securities. They were AAA, so the rating agencies just said, well, they're AAA. They're backing this stuff, so we'll make this stuff AAA. They didn't bother to stop and count how much of it they were doing. And they made them all AAA without thinking, hey, there comes a point, you're only AAA because you got all this extra money around. If you leverage it all on stupid stuff, you're not going to be AAA very long. But they didn't catch that. So that's another one of your bad guys is the rating agencies were kind of asleep at the switch. Now, that would have explained part of this crisis. That would have explained where we thought we were about a year ago. Because I think most people, what's been weird about this thing is we knew we had a problem a year ago, but man, we had no idea we were going to be where we are now. Okay? About a year ago, we kind of knew how many mortgages were in trouble, how many of these so-called subprime, no documentation mortgages there were, how many of those were in trouble, what the maturities were, and all this kind of stuff. And we kind of knew how big all that was. It was about $800 billion. Now, that's a big number. But it's not these trillion-dollar numbers you're seeing thrown around now. Okay? $800 billion is a big number. And that's kind of what we thought the losses would be in these mortgages. Which means, and that's a big number, but the markets can absorb that. The world financial markets trade trillions of dollars every day. They could, it would have been a hard thing to pill to swallow, but we could have done that. And if you notice, a year and a half ago, the mortgage companies had gone into bankruptcy because they already knew their part of the deal was history. The big banks were taking like $15 billion write-offs and $10 billion write-offs and $20 billion write-offs to adjust for all the losses they were having in their mortgages. And we thought that, we add all that up, we get to about $800 billion. We say, okay, this is going to be tough, but we can slug through this. And we get ourselves, and we think, okay, we're going to get through this thing okay. That's where those derivatives come in they always talk about, those mysterious things called derivatives. All a derivative is it's a security that's return is derived from something else. That is, you don't own the underlying thing. You just get paid like you did. For example, I can buy a derivative security today on the Consumer Price Index. Well, obviously, I don't own the Consumer Price Index. But I would get paid based on how much it moved up and down. And that's all a derivative is. And there's nothing wrong with them. They serve very good purpose in the financial system. Again, as long as they're not abused. Well, what these folks did, AIG and all the other big institutions, because they got into the habit too, and they started drinking the same Kool-Aid. Basically, what they did was not only did they write these credit default swaps, these things where they would take on the risk of all these mortgage securities, but then they started writing derivatives on those. That is, people could buy a security that didn't own the mortgages, but would just get paid based on what the mortgages did. Now, a way to think about that is a side bet. Okay? People can make side bets on these mortgages. And they started selling a whole bunch of these side bets. And that's where it really got into trouble. Now, my next bad guy, and the really last bad guy having this deal, is the Securities and Exchange Commission, the folks that regulate all these big companies.